who would have thought that we would be sitting here today when in Minneapolis, the call to disband and defund the police has become a reality. Just 2 days ago, anyone advancing such an abolitionist position would have been described as a liberal do-gooder or a freak, basically. So I agree very much with Abdul that this is an extraordinary moment. It's an exhilarating moment, but also it's a moment that sometimes I think that I'm developing a manic personality, because I'm also worried about the repression to come. Because as somebody said on the chat earlier, states are not going to roll over. Countries which Walden has described have a history of bombing people back to the Stone Age are not going to roll over. So the first point that I want to make is the protests have changed things overnight, and we need to build on this, because states are very good at learning across themselves, and we need to learn across ourselves too. And it's very interesting that the countries which have had the worst responses to the pandemic, which have failed to protect their people, United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, Philippines, all these countries are linked together and work together. And the second point I want to make in relation to the title, the need for internationalism. Yes, there is a need for internationalism, but there is also an internationalism already in the seeds of this movement, this fantastic movement that we've seen. And that is the issue of police violence has been internationalized. And I see in that a powerful riposte to the internationalisms of states and the way that states work together in international forums to export their weaponry for war and internal repression. Abdul spoke about the ritualization of street protests. A lot of my friends and colleagues here have been exhilarated by what's going on, but also like depressed about some of the ways that the mainstream in our society, let's say the capitalist enterprises, the fashion industry, are trying to take the Black Lives Matter into a brand of fashion. And I think that what we've seen on the streets of the United Kingdom and the streets of Europe with the mass protests in support of people in the United States protesting is that a powerful connection is being made between police racism and police violence across the UK and Europe. You will see in the UK, we've had for what, 20, 30 years, an organisation called United Families and Friends, who are the families of people who have died in police custody. We've been working on this issue at the Institute of Race Relations since 1991. In 2014, we reported on 509 deaths of BME people, refugee and migrants in the UK over from 1991 to 2014. Unfortunately, these names in the past have not been names known generally. And we're seeing that really taking off here. But the protests against the murder of George Floyd are linked to the deaths in custody in the UK of so many people. And the same is true in France, where 25,000 people protested over the weekend, and the case of Adama Traoré was highlighted. His family led the marches in Paris. He suffocated to death when three police officers sat on top of him. And in Germany, where we've seen mass protests, the name of Uri Jallo, who died in 2005 in a police cell, he was actually handcuffed by his hands and his feet to a mattress, and the police managed to say while he was tied, he managed to get hold of a lighter in his pocket and burn himself to death. So the fourth point I want to make is that patterns of police violence are international. Death squads are international, actually. One thing that I've been really concerned about over the last sort of couple of years is the kind of death squads that we see in the United States, what we see in the Philippines. They're also part of what's happening in Europe. In the European context, we're seeing collusion between far-right elements and elements of the military and the police. We saw this in Greece with the rise of Golden Dawn. We see this in Germany, where a far-right group called UNITA is a network of active and former soldiers who stole weapons and ammunition from army supplies and had a plan to eliminate politicians, left-wingers, and black people and refugees on day X. The fifth point I want to make is about Trump's speech. You know, when he wandered off with his security guards spraying everyone with tear gas, and he took the Bible in his hands. I mean, I've read that he actually had it upside down, so there's a lot of spirituality, obviously, in Donald Trump. But we've seen the same, it's been described as a fascist speech verging on a declaration of war against American citizens. And he's been criticised for hitching religion to the white supremacist cause. It's been happening here in Europe too, where people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Matteo Salvini in Italy have actually been talking about defending Christian Europe from a Muslim invasion. The targets have most often been migrants, refugees, and the Roma. So my sixth and final point is, we don't just need internationalism. We all need to dig down deeper in our specific locations for internal connectivity. Within the Black Lives Matter, there is a universal seed, and that universal seed is the universality of police violence across the world. But we also have to dig down deeper to understand that all the different communities who are actually suffering in this particular moment of times. We need, as Abdullah said, a race and class perspective. We need to connect with the cleaners, the agricultural workers, the migrant workers, all the people who have been the people whose work has been super exploited during the pandemic and who have carried us through the pandemic. I was recently really privileged to be asked by Husai Hung Pai, who is an award-winning journalist who's written fantastic books. She's just written a book about the treatment of agricultural migrant workers in Italy, and she asked me to write the foreword. The book's not out yet, but I'm sure Husai Hung Pai would forgive me from quoting from it. She writes about the Amorta, the silence of suffering that scars the lives of refugees in Europe, who are abandoned in farmhouses and shacks and tent cities without electricity, toilets, disinfectant or running water. These people are picking the crops that are keeping fresh vegetables and fresh fruit on our table. She concludes by saying, we need to challenge all social relations within a racist structure. We need the collapse and overthrow of all social relations determined by structural racism. I noticed in the chat that some people are concerned about the protests and social distancing and the impact that it could have on increasing the infection rate. But I think we have to roll back and also understand that this eruption has come because of a certain type of policing that has created a pressure cooker situation for many, many young people. So we've been charting the impacts of the discriminatory impacts of lockdown on IRR News, which is our free anti-racist social justice newsletter that goes out every couple of weeks. And I would urge you to sign up to that if you possibly can. And I think we have to look at things like what's happened in the UK. Can you believe it? In April, when there was hardly anyone in the streets, in April 2020, there were more stop and searches of black young people than there was in April 2019. What were the Metropolitan Police thinking about that level of repression on the streets? A lot of these young people live in high-rise estates where they don't have balconies, when they don't have gardens. And yet when they go and sit in the park, you get the right-wing media doing all these scare stories about selfish young people going out to the park. So you have this. Everyone knows that in terms of fines and arrests in the UK, it was black and migrant and refugee people who have had more arrests and more fines in terms of coronavirus regulations. The same is true in France, where I saw a figure today which actually said that on the first day of lockdown, the residents of Saint-Denis, which is a mainly immigrant area in Paris, got 10% of the fines of all the country. So, you know, this has definitely been part of the eruption. But finally, what I want to say is that there's another aspect of the lockdown that we have to consider, that bad as these statistics that I'm giving you are, there are certain categories of people who have been made invisible in this crisis, and they have suffered the worst. So that actually you have in migrant and refugee camps, you have in Roma camps in Europe, it hasn't been lockdown, it's been element of martial law with targeted quarantine. So when the military builds separation walls and guards checkpoints with guns, when drones with thermal sensors are remotely used to take the temperature of residents in Roma settlements, we are not talking about proportionate coronavirus-related restrictions, but we are talking about militarized confinement. And I think it's really, really important that we realize that this is a period where we have to look to ourselves. And that we need to start with the now and perhaps not get sort of too hung up with the abstract questions. I think Abdul made the point around what the defeat of Bernie Sanders meant in the US, and how I think there's this knowledge now that there is no hope of change from within the electoral process, from within the political parties. All the political parties are in bed with neoliberalism. There was a brief moment of hope in America and the UK that we could break with neoliberalism. There is no break. So the protest has moved to the streets. So one way that we end this use of police weaponry, or we tackle it, is we start with the now. I did a quick review this morning of what happened around Europe in terms of arrest and the use of police weaponry over the weekend. And okay, I know in America there's something like 10,000 arrests. In the UK and London, we have the use of horses to charge people, very, very dangerous. In a lot of other countries, in Marseille, Stockholm, Hamburg, Berlin, we have the use of pepper spray and tear gas. Who uses pepper spray and tear gas in the middle of a pandemic? Everybody knows that it causes the most coughing and all these terrible things. It's absolutely criminal. I understand there were over a couple of hundred arrests in Belgium, 100 arrests in Berlin. So the first thing we need to do is to mobilize around a strategy of self-defense within a commitment to strengthening the community outside of the state. There is a radical Black and anti-racist tradition in the UK as well. I noticed in the chat, I think the majority of the people at this webinar are from the UK. Hello to you all. But, you know, we have a tendency in the UK to always look to the US. We even, you know, for young people who denied their own, they've denied a teaching in our curriculum of the anti-racist and anti-imperialist tradition in this country. We need to read up and learn about our own traditions of police monitoring and self-defense. And which actually those traditions are reasserting themselves in a very positive way at the moment. One small thing that people could do is my colleague Sophia Siddiqui actually put together a reading list of all race and class articles on the whole history of Black self-defense and community mutual aid in this country. That piece is called "We Starved, but We Shared," and it's a good start to see the lessons from our own history. I also feel that we're in a moment, you know, Naomi Klein obviously writes about disaster capitalism, and Abdul spoke about the way that they are using this crisis over the pandemic for their own ends, for their own sort of almost like eugenicist ends. But I think we're also seeing that, and we're seeing it very, very clearly in the United Kingdom, the way that private companies are using the COVID-19 crisis to try and take over control of what should be public sector supply chains in the NHS, so that Serco, Palantir, faculty are getting all the contracts for COVID-19 tracing. And what we're really concerned about at the Institute is that we are going to see another Windrush scandal. We're going to see a second Windrush scandal as corporations like Palantir in the US, which is owned by a billionaire who is very, very close to Donald Trump and has perfected his wares through immigration policing in America. Can you imagine if people through the COVID-19 track and tracing system are giving their data to companies like Palantir, who have a history in immigration policing? Paradoxically, when I said how great it was to have a discussion about the need for internationalism, I've been thinking, as we've been talking, about the need to start with the local. So what I wanted to say to the younger people here is that you don't have to be at the barricade to start a revolution. You don't have to be part of an organised left party or a trade union. You just start from where you are at this particular moment. The local is incredibly important for challenging the logic of neoliberalism and fascism, which the logic is that people who are failed consumers don't matter, they're non-people. The logic is that if you have a mental illness, that if you are homeless, that if you are from a particular racialized minority, you're life unworthy of life. So all of us, each and every one of us, can start challenging that at a local level through mutual aid, through working in our schools, working with young people, working in youth centres, whatever. You know, there's so many wise sayings out there. It only takes a pebble to create an avalanche. The smallest spark can start a prairie fire. So we can all be part of that.